If you look closely at certain moments in history, you begin to realize that some stories are not meant to comfort you. They are not romantic, not heroic, and certainly not easy to digest. They exist to expose something uncomfortable, something raw about human nature. This is one of those stories. It does not live in the past as a distant memory, and it does not belong to museums or textbooks. It lingers quietly, reshaped and repackaged, but still very much alive in the world you are living in today. At first glance, it might seem like a story about relationships, or maybe about survival in a difficult time. But that would be too simple. Beneath the surface, it is really about how value is assigned to human beings when money becomes the dominant force in society. In a world where everything can be measured, priced, and exchanged, even something as personal as dignity begins to lose its meaning. What once felt sacred slowly becomes negotiable, and what used to define a person from within is replaced by what they can offer on the outside. In the early years of the 20th century, in a gray and uncertain social climate, marriage was no longer a celebration of love or connection. It became a calculation, a transaction. People were not asking who they wanted to build a life with. They were asking what they could gain. And when that question becomes the center of decision-making, something fundamental begins to shift. A human being is no longer seen as a person with emotions and depth. They are reduced to a function, a role, a tool that serves a purpose in a larger economic equation. Imagine a system where individuals are trained not to express who they are, but to become what others are willing to pay for. Where gestures, words, and even emotions are rehearsed, refined, and optimized for maximum return. A smile is no longer spontaneous. A glance is no longer sincere. Everything becomes intentional, calculated, and strategic. Not for connection, but for profit. And over time, the line between authenticity and performance begins to disappear. What makes this even more unsettling is how easily people adapt to it. When survival is at stake, and when opportunity seems limited, the idea of turning yourself into something marketable does not feel like a loss. It feels like a solution, a way out, a way forward. But that solution comes with a cost that is rarely discussed. Because when you begin to see yourself as something that can be priced, you also accept that you can be compared, evaluated, and ultimately replaced. And this is where the deeper psychological shift happens. Instead of asking who you are, you start asking how much you are worth. Instead of building a sense of identity from within you, begin to construct it based on how others respond to you. Approval becomes currency. Attention becomes validation. And without realizing it, you slowly disconnect from your own sense of self. Not because you want to, but because the system rewards you for doing so. If you step back and observe this pattern, you will notice something unsettling. This is not just a story about a specific place or time. It is a pattern that repeats itself whenever money becomes the central measure of value. The tools may change. The language may evolve. But the core dynamic remains the same. People begin to shape themselves according to what is desirable, not what is true. And in doing so, they trade something invisible but essential for something that can be counted and displayed. The uncomfortable truth is that this transformation does not happen overnight. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, one small compromise at a time, one decision justified by necessity, one step further away from authenticity, disguised as progress. And before long, the system no longer feels like something external. It becomes part of how people think, how they see themselves, and how they interact with the world around them. This is not a story about villains and victims in the traditional sense. It is about a system that reshapes people from the inside out. a system where the pursuit of financial security slowly erodes the boundaries of personal integrity. And the most dangerous part is not the system itself. It is how normal it begins to feel. How easily it blends into everyday life. How it convinces people that this is simply the way things are supposed to be. So, as you move through this story, it is worth asking yourself a simple but uncomfortable question. In a world where everything seems to have a price, what happens to the things that should not be for sale? And more importantly, what happens to you when you start believing that your value can be measured in the same way as everything else? As this system took shape, it did not present itself as something cruel or destructive. It appeared practical, even necessary. Families began to see opportunity where there had once been limitation, and individuals started to view themselves as assets that could be developed and positioned for better outcomes. On the surface, it looked like progress, but underneath something far more complex was unfolding. The language of care slowly blended with the language of calculation, and the difference between protecting someone and using them became harder to recognize. In many cases, the shift did not begin with individuals alone. It started within the family. The place that was meant to offer unconditional support and emotional safety began to operate under a different logic. Conversations that once centered around well-being and connection gradually turned into discussions about potential return and advantage. Decisions about relationships were no longer guided by compatibility or shared values. They were influenced by what could be gained, what could be secured, and what could be improved in terms of status or financial stability. What makes this dynamic particularly unsettling is how it is justified. Parents do not see themselves as harmful. They believe they are doing what is best. They convince themselves that they are helping their children escape hardship, that they are creating opportunities that would otherwise be unavailable. And in a way, they are not entirely wrong. The system does reward those who play by its rules. But the cost of that reward is often hidden beneath layers of rationalization. It is framed as sacrifice, as responsibility, as love expressed through difficult choices. For the individuals at the center of these decisions, the experience is deeply complicated. On one hand, they are told that they are valuable, that they have potential, that they can achieve more than the circumstances they were born into. On the other hand, that value is constantly tied to what they can provide, how they can perform, and how well they can meet expectations that were never truly their own. Over time, this creates a quiet tension, a sense that their worth is conditional, dependent on maintaining a certain image or fulfilling a certain role. And when a person begins to internalize that idea, something subtle but profound begins to change. They stop seeing themselves as someone with inherent value and start seeing themselves as something that must be maintained, improved, and protected in the eyes of others. Their identity becomes a project. Their life becomes a performance. Every choice is filtered through the question of how it will be perceived, how it will be judged, and whether it will increase or decrease their standing in the invisible marketplace they are part of. This is where the concept of self begins to fragment. Instead of a stable sense of who they are, people develop multiple versions of themselves, each designed to fit a different context or audience. There is the version that is presented to potential partners, the version that is shown to family, and the version that exists in private moments, often disconnected and uncertain. Maintaining these layers requires constant effort, and over time, it becomes exhausting. Not physically, but emotionally. Because the distance between who you are and who you present yourself to be continues to grow. What makes this even more complex is how the surrounding society reinforces it. Success stories are celebrated but rarely examined. People who achieve financial stability through these calculated paths are admired, even envied. Their lifestyle becomes a symbol of success, and their choices are often validated by the results they produce. This creates a powerful feedback loop. The more visible the rewards, the more appealing the system becomes. And the more appealing it becomes, the more people are willing to participate in it, even if it means compromising parts of themselves along the way. Over time, the idea of authenticity begins to feel less important than the idea of effectiveness. It is no longer about being true to yourself. It is about being strategic, about understanding what works, what attracts attention, what creates opportunity. And in a world that constantly rewards visibility and success, it becomes easy to forget that something is being lost in the process. Not all at once, but gradually, quietly, in ways that are difficult to measure but deeply felt. The result is a society where people are constantly adapting, constantly adjusting, constantly trying to align themselves with shifting expectations. It creates a sense of instability, even for those who appear to be doing well, because when your value is tied to external factors, it is always at risk. It can change, it can decline, it can disappear. And when that happens, the question that remains is not just what you have lost, but whether you ever truly knew who you were without it. When you follow this pattern far enough, you begin to see its long-term consequences, not just in individuals, but in entire communities. What started as a set of practical decisions slowly reshapes collective values. People begin to measure success in visible outcomes rather than internal stability. A comfortable lifestyle, a certain type of partner, or a carefully curated image becomes the standard. And once those standards are normalized, anything outside of them starts to feel like failure, even if it is more honest or more aligned with who someone truly is. In that environment, relationships themselves begin to change in subtle ways. They become less about connection and more about alignment of interests. Conversations shift from curiosity to evaluation, from understanding to comparison. Instead of asking whether someone feels right, people start asking whether someone fits into a plan. And while that approach can create short-term stability, it often leaves a quiet emptiness underneath. Because when a relationship is built on calculation, it struggles to hold meaning when circumstances change or when expectations are no longer met. There is also a deeper psychological cost that often goes unnoticed. When you constantly present a version of yourself designed to meet expectations, you begin to lose access to your natural responses. You hesitate before speaking, you filter your thoughts, and you question your instincts. Over time, this creates a sense of disconnection, not just from others, but from yourself. You may still function well, still achieve goals, still appear successful, but internally there is a growing sense that something is missing, something that cannot be easily explained. This is the moment where many people try to compensate. They invest more in external markers of success, believing that if they can reach a certain level, the feeling will go away. They upgrade their lifestyle, expand their network, or pursue more recognition. And for a while, it works. The distraction is effective. But eventually, the same question returns, often more quietly but more persistently. What is all of this for if it does not feel like it belongs to you? What makes this cycle difficult to break is how deeply it is embedded in the surrounding culture. From a young age, people are exposed to the idea that value must be proven, that success must be visible, and that recognition is a form of validation. These messages are reinforced through media, through social interactions, and through the stories that are celebrated. As a result, Even when someone begins to question the system, they often struggle to step outside of it, not because they lack awareness, but because they lack an alternative framework to rely on. And yet there are moments when the illusion becomes harder to maintain. Moments when the performance slips, when the carefully constructed identity feels fragile, and when the gap between external success and internal satisfaction becomes impossible to ignore. These moments are uncomfortable, sometimes even painful, but they are also important, because they reveal something that the system tries to hide. That value does not come from how well you fit into expectations, but from how honestly you relate to yourself and to others. The challenge, of course, is what to do with that realization. Walking away from a system that rewards you is not easy. Redefining success in a way that is not immediately recognized or validated by others requires a different kind of strength. It requires the ability to tolerate uncertainty, to accept that your path may not look impressive from the outside, and to trust that something more meaningful can be built over time. Not quickly, not visibly, but steadily and with intention. In a world that constantly encourages comparison and performance, choosing authenticity can feel like a disadvantage. It may not bring immediate rewards, and it may even create friction in relationships that were built on different expectations. But it also offers something that the system cannot provide: a sense of stability that does not depend on external conditions, a sense of identity that does not need to be constantly adjusted or protected, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of alignment between who you are and how you live. The question then becomes not whether the system exists, but how you choose to engage with it. Whether you allow it to define your value, or whether you use it as a tool without letting it shape your identity. Because at the end of the day, the most significant loss is not financial or social. It is the quiet disappearance of the self. And once that happens, no amount of external success can fully replace what was given up along the way. If you trace this pattern back to its roots, you begin to notice that it is not driven purely by greed or ambition. It is often driven by fear. The fear of falling behind, the fear of being left out, the fear of not having enough. These fears are powerful because they feel real, and in many cases, they are. Life can be uncertain, and security does matter. But when fear becomes the foundation of decision-making, it quietly reshapes priorities. It pushes people to choose what is safe over what is meaningful, and what is profitable over what is true. This is how the system sustains itself. It does not need to force anyone into it. It simply creates conditions where participation feels like the most reasonable choice. When you see others benefiting from it, when you feel pressure to keep up, and when alternatives seem unclear or risky, the path becomes almost automatic. You adjust, you optimize, you align yourself with what appears to work. And with each step, it becomes a little harder to step back and question whether the direction itself is right. Over time, this leads to a kind of collective agreement that is never explicitly stated. People begin to accept that certain compromises are normal, that certain trade-offs are unavoidable, that this is simply how the world operates. And once that belief takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing. Because if everyone is playing the same game, then choosing not to play can feel like stepping outside of reality itself. It can feel isolating, even irrational, to prioritize something that cannot be easily measured or compared. But there is a quiet contradiction within this system. While it promises stability and success, it often creates a constant sense of pressure, because the conditions that define value are always changing. What is desirable today may not be tomorrow. What is admired in one context may be ignored in another. This means that maintaining your position requires continuous effort, continuous adjustment, continuous awareness of how you are perceived. And that kind of vigilance over time can become exhausting in ways that are difficult to articulate. At some point, many people reach a moment where they begin to question not just their choices, but the assumptions behind those choices. They start to notice that even when they achieve what they were aiming for, the sense of fulfillment is incomplete. There is a gap between what they expected to feel and what they actually experience. And that gap cannot be closed by doing more of the same. It requires a different kind of reflection, a willingness to look beyond outcomes and examine the process that led to them. This is where insight begins to emerge, not as a dramatic realization, but as a gradual shift in perspective. You begin to see that value is not something that can be fully defined by external metrics. That identity is not something that should be constantly negotiated based on circumstances. And that stability, in its truest sense, comes from something more internal. Something that is built over time through awareness and tension, and a certain level of honesty with yourself. From this point, a different framework becomes possible. One that does not reject the realities of the world, but also does not surrender to them completely. It allows you to engage with opportunities, to build a career, to pursue financial goals, but without losing sight of who you are in the process. It shifts the focus from maximizing short-term gain to building long-term alignment, from reacting to expectations to defining your own standards. This does not mean that the path becomes easier. In fact, it often becomes more challenging. Because you are no longer following a script that has already been validated by others. You are creating something that is more personal, more uncertain, and sometimes less visible. But it also carries a different kind of reward. Not the kind that can be easily displayed or compared, but the kind that is felt internally. A sense of coherence, a sense of direction that does not depend on constant validation. And in that space, something begins to shift. The need to constantly prove your value starts to fade. The pressure to maintain a certain image becomes less intense. You become more selective about what you invest your time and energy into, not because you no longer care about success, but because you begin to define success differently, in a way that includes not just what you achieve, but how you achieve it and who you become along the way. This is not a complete escape from the system. It is a different way of moving within it, a way that allows you to participate without being consumed, to benefit without being defined. And while it may not offer the same immediate rewards, it offers something that is often overlooked. The ability to live in a way that feels consistent, grounded, and ultimately your own. If you bring this perspective into the present moment, the parallels become impossible to ignore. The environment may look more polished, more advanced, even more liberating, but the underlying mechanics have not disappeared. They have simply evolved. Instead of physical spaces, much of the interaction now happens through screens. Instead of direct transactions, value is exchanged through attention, visibility, and influence. But the same question still sits quietly beneath it all. What are you worth? And how is that worth being measured? Today, the pressure does not always come from family or immediate community. It comes from a constant stream of comparison. You see curated lives, carefully edited moments, and versions of success that appear effortless and complete. And even when you know intellectually that these images are selective, they still shape perception. They create a subtle expectation that you should be doing more, achieving more, becoming more. And without realizing it, you begin to adjust your behavior to match that expectation. This is where the concept of personal branding enters the picture. On the surface, it is presented as a way to express yourself, to share your identity, to create opportunities. And in many ways, it can be useful. But When it becomes the primary way you relate to the world, it starts to shift your focus. You begin to think in terms of presentation rather than experience. You start asking how a moment will look instead of how it feels. And gradually, your life becomes something that is not just lived, but constantly curated. The danger is not in using these tools, but in becoming dependent on them for a sense of value. Because when your identity is tied to how it is received, it becomes fragile. It fluctuates with feedback, with trends, with the unpredictable nature of attention itself. One moment you feel recognized, the next you feel invisible. And that cycle can be difficult to step out of because it offers both validation and uncertainty at the same time. There is also a deeper layer to this dynamic. When you present a version of yourself that is optimized for approval, you may begin to lose touch with parts of yourself that do not fit that image. You silence certain thoughts, avoid certain expressions, and gradually narrow the range of who you allow yourself to be. Over time, this creates a gap between your internal experience and your external presentation. And maintaining that gap requires energy awareness and constant adjustment. At some point, the question becomes unavoidable. What happens when the version of you that is being presented no longer feels real? What happens when the effort to maintain it becomes more exhausting than rewarding? For some people, this leads to a quiet withdrawal. For others, it leads to a search for something more stable, something that does not depend on continuous validation. But in both cases, it marks a turning point, a moment where the focus begins to shift from outward performance to inward understanding. This is where reflection takes on a different role. It is no longer about analyzing what works or what gains attention. It is about understanding what feels true, what feels aligned, and what feels sustainable over time. It involves asking questions that are not easily answered by external metrics. Questions about purpose, about boundaries, about the kind of life you actually want to build beyond what is visible to others. And while these questions may not provide immediate clarity, they begin to create space. Space to step back from automatic patterns. Space to reconsider assumptions that were never fully examined. Space to reconnect with aspects of yourself that may have been set aside in the process of adapting. It is not a dramatic shift, but a gradual reorientation. One that moves you away from constant comparison and toward a more grounded sense of direction. In a world that constantly encourages you to become more visible, more optimized, and more aligned with external expectations. Choosing to focus on internal consistency can feel unfamiliar. It may not attract attention in the same way. It may not be immediately rewarded, but it offers something that is increasingly rare, a sense of stability that is not dependent on how you are perceived, a sense of value that does not fluctuate with circumstances. And perhaps that is the quiet realization that brings everything together. That while the system continues to evolve, the fundamental choice remains the same. Whether to define yourself through what can be measured, or to build a life that reflects something deeper, something less visible, but far more enduring.